The word weak echoed through the courtroom. It hung in the air, a final, damning verdict from her husband's sneering lawyer. Ilara Vance sat perfectly still, her hands folded on the cold table, the picture of quiet defeat. Across the aisle, her soon-to-be ex-husband, Damien, barely concealed his smirk. For months, they had painted her as the fragile, dependent spouse, a decorative burden with no mind for business, no stomach for conflict. The judge's eyes held a flicker of pity. The gallery saw a woman crumbling. Then the clerk, monotonous and routine, read the formal docket. Case 734B, regarding the dissolution of marriage and associated financial disentanglement between Damien Marcus Thorne. He adjusted his glasses. And Ilara Siobhan Van Holt Thorne. Heads lifted, papers shuffled. A sharp intake of breath came from the Thorne family's side. The judge's pen stopped midair. Van Holt. That name carried weight, a legacy carved in steel, shipping lanes, and private equity. It was a name whispered in boardrooms, not divorce courts. Everyone in that room, from the bailiff to Damien, whose face had just drained of all color, suddenly understood they had misjudged her. The woman they called weak wasn't breaking. She had been waiting, and the game had just changed. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button and comment where you're watching from. The word weak echoed through the courtroom. It wasn't shouted, but delivered with a precise clinical chill by Catherine Reed, Damien Thorne's attorney. The syllables seemed to linger in the air-conditioned sterility of the chamber, attaching itself to the still, slender figure of Ilara Thorne. She didn't flinch. Her hands, folded on the polished mahogany table before her, remained steady. She wore a simple, dove-gray sheath dress, no jewelry save for a thin platinum band on her right ring finger. To the judge, to the gallery, to her own seemingly overwhelmed counsel, she was a portrait of silent defeat. Across the aisle, Damien allowed a faint, sympathetic sigh to escape, a masterpiece of performative regret. He was all clean lines and controlled power in his custom suit, his dark hair perfectly styled. The narrative had been meticulously constructed over these last torturous months of proceedings. Damien Thorne, the visionary real estate developer, the creator of empires, burdened by a fragile, dependent wife who could not match his drive or understand his pressures. The asset division was a foregone conclusion. They were merely here to formalize the dissection of a life, with Damien generously offering the bare minimum to keep his delicate ex-wife afloat. Lara's mind, however, was not in the present chill of the courtroom. It was 7 years prior in a sun-drenched vineyard in Tuscany. Damien, younger, his ambition more a sparkle than a hardened edge, had taken both her hands in his. "I don't care about your father's name, his money, his world," he had said, his voice thick with earnest passion. "I love you, Ilara, just you. Promise me we'll always be us, just us. No shadows, no legacies." And she foolishly, beautifully in love had promised. The prenuptial agreement she'd signed was an afterthought, a document he'd called a silly formality for my investors. She signed Ilara Thorne with a flourish, seeing it not as a legal shackle, but as a symbol of her commitment to that promise, to be Ilara, not a Van Holt. She had dimmed her own light so his could shine brighter, believing it was a shared glow. The evidence clearly shows a profound imbalance in the economic partnership of this marriage, Catherine Reed continued, her heels clicking on the marble floor as she approached the bench. She presented graphs, pie charts, summaries of bank statements. Mr. Thorne's companies, Thorne Properties, Aurora Developments, the Seacliff Resorts Project, have seen exponential growth, demanding his constant, intensive labor. Mrs. Thorne, while undoubtedly a gracious hostess, here she offered a condescending nod in Ilara's direction, has had no independent income, no financial contributions, and has, by her own admission in deposition, relied entirely on my client for her lifestyle, her security, her very sense of self. Another memory intruded, sharp and painful. Last year, the night of Damien's biggest deal closing. He'd come home vibrating with triumph, a bottle of Dom Perignon in hand. She prepared his favorite meal. "To us, my love," he'd toasted, pulling her close. "To building something real." She'd smiled, pushing down the instinct to mention that the offshore equity firm financing his Seacliff Resorts project had been surprisingly amenable, that their term sheet was unusually favorable. She'd known because her father's longtime consigliere, Martin, had mentioned it in one of their discreet weekly calls. "The Van Holt interest in the fund appears to be proceeding," Martin had said. She'd simply nodded, sipping her champagne, choosing to be the wife, not the heiress. She had protected Damien's ego like a precious vase. Conversely, Catherine's voice sliced through the reverie, my client has shouldered the entirety of the marital debt, the risk, the entrepreneurial stress. Mrs. Thorne's days, as documented, consisted of yoga classes, charitable luncheons, and interior decorating. Laudable pursuits, perhaps, but not contributory. She is, in the cold arithmetic of this court, the weaker financial party, a dependent. Ilara's lawyer, a kind-faced man named Robert Gable, rose to object, but his protest was soft, almost perfunctory. "Your Honor, my client's contributions to the well-being and social capital of the marriage cannot be so easily quantified." "But they must be, Mr. Gable," the judge, a weary-looking man with silver temples, interjected. "That is, unfortunately, the task before us, and the evidence presented by Ms. Reed is compelling in its clarity." He shuffled the papers, a frown deepening the lines on his face. He looked at Ilara, and his eyes held not malice but a pity that was somehow worse. It was the look one gives a wounded bird one cannot help. Damien chose that moment to lean forward, his voice a low, pained rumble meant to be heard. "Your Honor, if I may, I want this to be fair, I truly do. Ilara, she's not equipped for this world. The cut and thrust, I'll ensure she's taken care of. The settlement we've proposed is more than adequate for her needs." He offered a lifeline laced with poison, reinforcing the image of the helpless woman who needed his magnanimity to survive. The gallery, a handful of Damien's supportive siblings and a couple of bored legal interns, murmured approvingly. This was the expected script, the successful man, freeing himself with gentlemanly regret. Ilara felt the weight of their collective gaze, the unspoken verdict. She should be grateful for whatever he gives her. Catherine, sensing the final nail was ready, moved in. "Given this undeniable disparity, we ask the court to adopt our proposed division in full. Mr. Thorne retains 100% ownership in all business entities and associated properties. The marital residence, purchased with his premarital funds and mortgage paid by his income, is his sole property. In lieu of alimony, given the short duration of the marriage and the lack of contributory sacrifice from Mrs. Thorne, we propose a single lump sum payment of $250,000. A clean break, Your Honor. It is more than equitable, it is charitable." Charitable. The word bounced off the wood-paneled walls. It was the final, elegant insult. Ilara looked down at her hands. The thin platinum band caught the fluorescent light. It was not her wedding ring, she'd taken that off the day he'd moved out. This was older, a gift from her mother on her 16th birthday, a Van Holt heirloom. She rubbed her thumb over its cool surface. Robert Gable was speaking again, his voice tinged with desperation, citing cases about non-financial contributions, standard of living. But the wind was gone from his sails. The judge was already making notes, the tip of his pen scratching out her future. Then Catherine Reed, in her moment of absolute victory, made her fatal error. She wanted not just to win, but to annihilate, to etch Damien's narrative into the official record. "Your Honor, in summary, my client built an empire from nothing, from sweat and vision. Mrs. Thorne brings nothing to the table but a need for maintenance. She is, frankly, the weaker party in every conceivable facet of this partnership. Emotionally, financially, constitutionally. It is time Mr. Thorne is released from this burden to continue his work unencumbered. Weaker in every conceivable facet." The promise in Tuscany shattered not with a bang but with the crisp, legalistic pronunciation of that word. Weak. It wasn't just a legal strategy anymore, it was his truth. He believed it. He had always, in the end, believed it. The love she had protected, the identity she had submerged, the silent power she had wielded to buoy him, all of it was reduced to this, a burden, a weakness. A profound stillness settled over Ilara. It was not the stillness of defeat, but the absolute calm of a decision long considered, finally reached. The vault door in her soul, held shut by a promise, clicked open. The love that had locked it was gone. All that remained was the cold, clean light of truth. She turned her head slightly, not to her ineffectual lawyer, but to the quiet, sharp-eyed woman sitting in the row behind him, a woman who had been taking notes on a tablet all morning. This was Sarah, not a paralegal, but her personal executive assistant from the Van Holt Trust, embedded there on Robert Gable's team for precisely this moment. Alara gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Sarah tapped Robert Gable's arm and passed him a single sticky note. Gable, confused, glanced at it. His eyes widened. He blinked, then looked back at Alara. She met his gaze and gave one firm, clear nod. The game was over. The performance was ending. Robert Gable stood. His posture was different now. The stoop of apology was gone, replaced by a newfound rigidity. "Your Honor," he said, his voice firmer than it had been all day. "Before the court is influenced by this characterization, and before you issue any ruling, we must insist, for the absolute, unambiguous clarity of the record, that the court clerk read the full, legal names of both parties as they appear on the original marriage license, and the prenuptial agreement entered into evidence. Not the shortened forms used in these proceedings, the full, formal names." A flicker of annoyance crossed the judge's face. "Mr. Gable, is this necessary? We all know who the parties are." "With respect, Your Honor," Gable said, his voice now carrying a weight it had lacked before, "I believe it is critically necessary. For the record." The judge sighed, waving a dismissive hand at the clerk. "Very well, for the record." The clerk, a bored young man, pulled the original filing from the docket. He adjusted his microphone, his voice a monotone recitation of routine. "Case 734B, regarding the dissolution of marriage and associated financial disentanglement between Damien Marcus Thorne," he droned on, then flipped a page to the respondent. "And Alara Siobhan." He paused, squinting slightly at the cursive script. He cleared his throat. "Alara Siobhan Van Holt Thorne." He said it without emphasis, Van Holt Thorne. But in the sterile quiet of the courtroom, the name detonated. Damien's head snapped up as if yanked by a wire. His smirk froze, then melted into a slow-motion wash of confusion. His brain, so adept at spreadsheets and contracts, tried to process. Van Holt? A coincidence. A middle name she never used. Catherine Reed stopped dead. Her confident stance faltered. She turned sharply to look at Damien, a silent, frantic question in her eyes. Damien was staring at Alara, his mouth slightly agape. A low rustle swept the gallery. Damien's brother, who worked in finance, leaned forward, whispering urgently to his sister. "Van Holt, the Van Holt, Alistair Van Holt." The judge, who had been about to set down his pen, slowly placed it on the bench instead. He removed his glasses, his eyes narrowing as he looked at Alara, really looked at her for the first time. Not as a dependent, but as a person with a name that was not just a name, but a landmark. Alara did not look at Damien. She did not smile in triumph. She simply sat, the quiet eye of the hurricane her name had just unleashed. She watched the judge, waiting. The woman they called weak had just spoken the only word that mattered without uttering a sound. It was a word woven into the fabric of global commerce, of private equity, of legacy. It was a word that turned charitable lump sums into grotesque jokes. It was the key to the vault, and she had finally turned it. The silence in the courtroom was no longer the quiet of boredom or procedure. It was a thick, pressurized void, a collective held breath. The air seemed to vibrate with the echoes of the name. Van Holt. It hung in the space between the benches, a word that had transformed from a name into a fundamental rearrangement of reality. Alara watched the shockwave travel. She saw the exact moment Damien's cognitive dissonance shattered, the precise instant when confused recognition crystallized into gut-churning horror. His eyes, locked on her, widened, then darted frantically to Catherine, to the judge, to his family in the gallery, as if searching for someone to tell him it was a mistake. His face, so confidently smug moments before, drained of all color, leaving a pale, waxy mask. The empire builder looked suddenly, profoundly small. Catherine Reed, the razor-sharp litigator, was frantically, silently scrolling through her tablet, her fingers a blur. The composure that was her armor had developed a hairline fracture. She was searching for something, anything, in her own files that she had missed, a footnote, a clause, a mention of a maiden name that she had dismissed as irrelevant. She found nothing, because Alara Siobhan Van Holt Thorne had, with meticulous care over 8 years, made sure of it. The judge carefully placed his reading glasses back on his nose, his movements deliberate. He looked from the clerk to Alara to Damien. The paternalistic pity in his eyes was gone, replaced by a sharp, calculating focus. "The record will reflect the full names of the parties," he said, his voice measured. "Mr. Gable, you insisted on this clarification. Would you care to elaborate on its relevance to these proceedings?" Robert Gable stood. The transformation in him was complete. The hesitant advocate was gone. In his place stood a man who had just been handed the keys to the armory. He buttoned his suit jacket, a gesture of grim finality. "Thank you, Your Honor. The relevance is not merely genealogical. It goes to the very heart of the imbalance Ms. Reed has so passionately and incorrectly articulated. It speaks to the true nature of the assets, the provenance of certain funds, and the validity of the characterization of my client as dependent." He turned and nodded to Sarah, who rose and approached the bench with a new, slim binder. It was not the overstuffed file of marital bickering, but something sleek and serious. "With the court's permission, we submit a supplemental disclosure, previously withheld as it pertains solely to my client's separate property, which was, under the terms of the prenuptial agreement, not subject to division. However, in light of the opposing counsel's portrayal of my client's financial status and contributions, full transparency is now required to correct a profound misapprehension." "Objection, Your Honor." Catherine Reed found her voice, but it was higher, tighter than before. "This is a blatant ambush. New evidence cannot be introduced at this." "These are not new marital assets, Your Honor," Gable interrupted smoothly. "They are elucidating documents pertaining to identity and the origin of capital already entangled in this case. They explain why my client has never needed nor sought a penny of Mr. Thorne's so-called generosity." The judge held up a hand, his eyes on the binder now in his possession. "Overruled, Ms. Reed. I'll allow it. Proceed, Mr. Gable." Gable opened the binder. Document 1. The Certificate of Trust for the Van Holt Family Dynasty Trust, of which my client, Alara Siobhan Van Holt, is the sole lifetime beneficiary and has been the acting trustee since her 25th birthday, 4 years into the marriage. He let that settle. Acting trustee. Not a passive recipient, but the active manager of a legacy. The corpus of the trust is detailed in the attached, sealed schedule, but for the purposes of today, its existence establishes my client's independent and significant financial capacity, wholly separate from this marriage. Damien made a sound, a choked-off gasp. "Trustee," he whispered, not to the court, but to the air between them. The wife who needed help balancing her checkbook was the trustee of a dynasty trust. Document 2, Gable continued, his voice a steady, devastating drumbeat. Corporate ownership and capital trail for the following entities: Thorne Properties LLC, Aurora Developments Inc., and the Seacliff Resorts Limited Partnership. He placed a series of clear, color-coded charts on the evidence projector. On the screen, Damien's companies appeared. Lines drew from them not to banks but to a series of holding companies with innocuous names: Marlin Equity Fund VI, LP, Oceanic Capital Partners. Another line in bold red traced back from these funds to a single entity, VH Master Holdings LLC. The initial seed capital for Thorne Properties, a loan of $2 million at a below-market interest rate, originated from Marlin Equity, Gable explained. The majority venture funding for Aurora Developments and the crucial bridging finance for the Seacliff project came from Oceanic Capital. These were presented by Mr. Thorne as independent, hard-won financial coups. He paused, looking directly at Damien. VH Master Holdings is the primary investment vehicle of the Van Holt Family Trust. Another wave of murmurs crashed through the gallery. Damien's brother put his head in his hands. Alara watched Damien. She saw the memories flashing behind his eyes, his triumphant boasting about securing the impossible financing, her quiet smile over dinner, her occasional, gentle questions about a project's timeline or a partner's reputation, which he dismissed as wifely interest. She hadn't been asking, she had been monitoring. "These are not silent partnerships, Your Honor," Gable pressed on. "As beneficiary and trustee, my client had full visibility and through her appointed trust directors, indirect but substantial influence over these investments. Her contribution was not baking cookies for open houses. It was the strategic deployment of capital that built the very empire Mr. Thorne now claims as his sole creation. She didn't bring nothing to the table. She provided the table." Catherine Reed was on her feet again. "Your Honor, this is speculation. There is no evidence, Mrs. MS. Van Holt Thorne had any operational role. Beneficiary status does not equate to labor or contribution." "Which brings us to document 3, Gable said, unflustered. "The prenuptial agreement, specifically clause 4.2, which defines separate property." He read aloud, his voice filling the room. "Separate property of Alara shall include, but not be limited to, any and all interests, both current and future, in the Van Holt Family Trust, its subsidiaries, and any assets or entities in which said trust holds an interest, regardless of any marital effort expended toward the management or growth of said entities, which effort is hereby deemed a gift." He looked up. "The agreement my client signed, at Mr. Thorne's urging to protect his future, explicitly protects hers, and it defines any effort she made toward the success of companies funded by her trust not as a marital contribution, but as a gift. A gift, Your Honor, that Mr. Thorne now repays by portraying her as a financial parasite." The final card had been played. The elegant legal trap snapped shut. The judge leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. He looked at Damien, whose earlier confidence had curdled into a kind of stunned, vacant terror. He looked at Catherine Reed, who was now scribbling frantic notes, her case in ruins around her. Finally, his gaze landed on Alara. "Ms. Van Holt Thorne," the judge said, the formal name now feeling like the only appropriate one. "You have sat silently through these proceedings while a certain narrative was constructed. Do you wish to address the court, to clarify your position?" Every eye turned to her. This was the moment, not for theatrics but for testimony. Alara rose slowly, smoothing the gray wool of her dress. She did not look at Gable for reassurance. She did not glance at the gallery. She looked directly at the judge, her posture not defiant but rooted in a calm, unassailable authority. "Your Honor," she began, her voice clear and steady without a tremor. It was a voice no one in the room had ever heard, not the soft, accommodating wife, not the hesitant deponent. It was the voice of a woman accustomed to being heard in boardrooms. The weakness presented here was a performance, one I agreed to enact for the entirety of my marriage at my husband's request. He asked for a partnership where our pasts did not interfere. I honored that. I used my married name. I lived within the means his income provided, not my own. I never spoke of my family's business." She turned her head just enough to let Damien feel the full weight of her gaze. "The nothing I brought to the table was a conscious choice. I brought patience. I brought discretion. And yes, I brought capital I directed toward his dreams, believing they were our dreams. I did not seek credit. I sought a partnership." Her voice hardened just a fraction. "What I did not agree to, Your Honor, was being dismantled in a court of law. Being portrayed as a burden for accepting the very role I was asked to play. Being called weak for honoring a vow of silence that was, itself, the cornerstone of our marriage." She turned back to the judge. The reading of my name was not a trick, it was a correction. I am Alara Siobhan Van Holt Thorne. I have always been both. The woman who loved Damien Thorne and the heir to a legacy I have never shirked. He chose today to see only the first and weaponize it against me. That choice has consequences, not of vengeance, your honor, but of truth. The truth is now on the record. She sat down. The silence returned, deeper and more profound than before. Damien was shaking his head, a frantic, involuntary motion. You lied, he rasped, the words tearing from his throat. You lied to me all these years. This was a setup, entrapment. Catherine Reed placed a restraining hand on his arm, but he shook it off, surging to his feet, pointing a trembling finger at Alara. You let me believe. You let me think it was all me, all my work, my genius, and you were just pulling the strings from your ivory tower. His voice broke, a mixture of fury and a bewildered, humiliated grief. Alara looked at him then, her expression not one of triumph, but of a deep, exhausted sorrow. No, Damien, she said, her voice quiet but carrying. I was in the trenches with you. I just never felt the need to wear a badge that said general. You're the one who demanded I hand over my uniform and then called me a civilian when the bullets started flying. The judge slammed his gavel once sharply. That is enough. Mr. Thorne, you will control yourself or you will be removed. He took a deep breath, looking over the wreckage of the morning. Counsel, we are adjourned for 1 hour. I suggest you use the time. When we reconvene, we will discuss the enforcement of the prenuptial agreement, the implications of the capital trail presented, and, he added, his voice dropping to a dangerous calm, the possibility of sanctions for bad faith litigation based on the deliberate and now demonstrably false portrayal of Ms. Van Holt Thorne's financial status. This court does not appreciate being used as a stage for fiction. The 1-hour recess stretched like a live wire in the courthouse halls. Damien and Catherine Reed vanished into a private conference room, the door shutting with a muffled, definitive thud that sounded like a vault ceiling. Alara remained at the defense table, sipping a glass of water Sarah had brought her. She did not pace. She did not fidget. She existed in a bubble of profound stillness, the eye of the hurricane she had summoned. Robert Gable was poring over documents with Sarah, a new, fierce energy in their hushed conversation. The gallery, now abuzz with a shocked, giddy energy, slowly filtered out, Damien's family members leaving with ashen faces and hurried steps, avoiding the glances of the few reporters who had caught the scent of a seismic story. Inside the conference room, a different storm raged. Damien was a raw nerve, packing the confined space like a caged animal. She played me, Catherine, for 8 years. It was all a fucking lie. His voice was a ragged mix of fury and a dawning, humiliated despair. He wasn't thinking about the legal ramifications yet. He was reevaluating every moment, every quiet smile, every piece of gentle advice. Had she been guiding him, mocking him? The foundation of his entire adult identity, the self-made man, had been revealed as a carefully curated facade, propped up by her unseen billions. Catherine Reed, her professional mask now tightly clamped back in place but her eyes betraying exhaustion and simmering anger, faced him. Stop it, Damien. Your feelings are irrelevant now. Your version of events is irrelevant. We are in a damage containment scenario of the highest order. She tapped her pen violently on the notepad before her. The prenup is ironclad. Worse, her separate property is so vast and so entangled in your companies that claiming she contributed nothing is not just false, it's legally suicidal. The judge is already talking about bad faith sanctions. Do you understand what that means? We could be ordered to pay her legal fees, millions, and that's the best case scenario. The companies, Damien choked out, finally landing on the practical horror. What happens to my companies? Catherine closed her eyes briefly. They are not your companies, Damien, not in the way you presented them. They are enterprises majority funded by a fund controlled by her trust. Under the terms of her trust and the prenup, she has every right to demand an immediate liquidation of those interests to sever the connection. Given the publicity this will generate, the partners you have in other projects will flee. Your reputation is not just damaged, it's toxic." She spelled it out with brutal clarity. "She can pull the plug, and she will. You will be left with your name, a few minor holdings, and a mountain of debt that was serviceable only with the Van Holt capital stream." The color that had returned to Damien's face during his outburst drained away again. He sank into a chair, the fight leaving him, replaced by the hollow chill of total ruin. "What do I do?" he whispered, the empire builder gone, leaving only a lost, frightened man. "You sit there," Catherine said, her voice cold. "You say nothing unless I tell you to. You look contrite. You do not look at her. When we go back in, we are going to try to negotiate the least catastrophic settlement possible. We are not fighting for assets anymore. We are fighting to avoid financial and professional annihilation." Back in the courtroom, the air had changed. The pity was gone, replaced by a focused, almost electric anticipation. The judge entered, his demeanor transformed. The weary arbiter was gone. In his place was a jurist presented with a case of attempted fraud on the court, wrapped in the velvet of marital dissolution. "Mr. Gable, Ms. Reed," the judge began without preamble. "Given the revelations of the last session, I am considering this matter not merely as a dissolution, but as a case where one party may have engaged in a deliberate campaign to mislead this court for financial gain. Before I rule on the original motion, I am inclined to hear arguments on sanctions. However, I will first allow a brief recess for any discussion of settlement, now that the parties are operating from a position of full information." Catherine Reed stood. "Thank you, Your Honor. My client wishes to address the court briefly, and then we would welcome a chance to confer." The judge nodded, his expression inscrutable. Damien stood, his shoulders slumped. He did not look at Alara. He stared at the judge's bench, his voice a low, hollow monotone. "Your Honor, I wish to apologize to the court, and to Alara. I operated under a significant misapprehension. My actions were based on that misapprehension. I deeply regret the characterization that was presented." Each word seemed physically painful. It was not an apology for betrayal, but for a tactical error, for being caught. The judge simply nodded again, unimpressed. "Noted, you may confer." The negotiation that followed was not between Robert Gable and Catherine Reed. It was a dictation of terms from Sarah, via Gable, to a capitulating Reed. Alara had already decided. There would be no drawn-out war. Clean, surgical, and final. The terms were read into the record 15 minutes later. Damien Thorne would retain personal possessions and a single, smaller property not tied to the trust-funded ventures. All shares, partnership interests, and debt instruments in Thorne Properties, Aurora Developments, and the Seacliff Resorts LP held directly or indirectly by the Van Holt Trust would be immediately transferred to a receiver for liquidation, with proceeds returning to the trust. Damien would be responsible for any tax liabilities or personal guarantees on those projects. The marital home, purchased with commingled funds, his income, her hidden capital enhancing that income's value, would be sold, with 70% of the net proceeds going to Alara, reflecting the true source of the capital's growth. He would drop all claims to any spousal support. Crucially, he would also sign a non-disclosure agreement regarding Alara's identity and family wealth, and a statement admitting that his prior financial disclosures to the court were incomplete and inaccurate, thus avoiding formal sanctions but leaving the truth in the record. In exchange, she would not pursue him for her legal fees. She would not press for a formal finding of fraud. It was not mercy. It was efficiency. Paying his legal fees would have been a rounding error in her ledger, but letting him drown in them would have created a persistent, angry enemy. This way, he was neutralized. Broken, but not destitute enough to be desperate. He would survive, but the empire, the persona, was gone. The judge approved the settlement without comment. The gavel fell. It was over. The walk out of the courtroom was the final, silent testimony. Alara gathered her things, a single leather folio. Nothing more. Damien sat, staring at the polished wood of the table, unable or unwilling to move. Catherine Reed packed her bags with sharp, angry motions, her professional record forever tarnished by the client who had failed to disclose he was a puppet with invisible strings. As Alara passed his table, he finally moved. He looked up, his eyes red-rimmed, not with tears of sadness but of sheer, world-shattering shock. "Why?" he rasped, the single word containing 8 years of confusion and betrayal. "Why the charade? If you had all that, why me?" She stopped, not for him but for the ghost of the woman who had loved him. She saw the vineyard again, but the sun was cold now. "I loved the man who said he wanted just us," she said, her voice quiet, final, and utterly devoid of malice. "I became just Alara for him. You're not that man. You're the man who called that version of me weak because you couldn't see the strength it took to build you up while staying invisible." She leaned in just a fraction. "You didn't lose a fortune today, Damien. You lost a woman who would have moved heaven and earth for you, and you did it for a spreadsheet." She turned and walked away, the click of her heels on the marble the only sound in the hushed room. He did not follow. The courthouse steps were a chaos of shouted questions and flashing cameras. "Ms. Van Holt, is it true you're Alistair Van Holt's daughter? Did you deceive your husband? What about the companies?" Alara did not pause. She did not smile or cry. Sarah materialized at her side, a subtle barrier against the tide. A sleek gunmetal gray sedan, not a limousine but something understated and powerfully built, pulled to the curb. A driver held the door. She slid inside, the door shut, muting the cacophony. The car pulled smoothly into traffic. "Martin is on the line for you, Ms. Van Holt," Sarah said from the front passenger seat, handing back a secured phone. Alara took it. "Martin." The voice on the other end was old, cultured, and held a deep warmth. "It's done then." "It's done. A clean execution. Your father is satisfied, more than satisfied, he's proud." Alara looked out the window at the city scrolling by, a city where she now owned, through various trusts, several of the very towers Damien had once pointed to as symbols of his ambition. Tell him the trust's interests in the Thorn Ventures are being liquidated. Have the team prepare a memo on redeploying the capital. The Green Energy Infrastructure Fund in Scandinavia looks promising. Of course, a pause, and you, Alara. She was silent for a long moment, watching the world she had always been part of but had viewed from a self-imposed distance. The weight of the performance was gone. The constant vigilance of hiding her thoughts, her knowledge, her power had lifted. In its place was not giddy freedom, but a vast, quiet responsibility and a profound loneliness for the simple, ordinary love she had believed in. "I'm fine, Martin. Take me to the office, please." The office was not in a glittering, name-brand tower. It was on the top floor of a renovated stone-built building in the historic district, the name Van Holt Holdings etched in subtle brass by the entrance. Inside, it was all clean lines, modern art, and breathtaking views of the river. Alara's personal office was spare. A desk of reclaimed oak, a single photograph of her mother, a vibrant woman who had died too young, a live orchid, and a large screen currently showing a real-time feed from a major shipping port in Singapore, cranes moving like silent dancers against the night sky, a Van Holt interest. She placed her folio on the desk and stood before the window. The city's lights began to twinkle in the dusk. On her computer, a discreet notification chimed. The transfer of the Thorn partnership interests was complete. The receiver had been appointed. The disentanglement was underway. Her personal phone, not the secured one, lit up. A single text from an unknown number. "Heard what happened. You okay?" James, an old friend from business school, one of the few who knew both sides of her. He ran a tech firm she'd invested in through a blind fund. She smiled, a small, genuine thing. "I will be," she typed back. "Coffee next week, on me." She powered down the court day phone, the one connected to Alara Thorn. She turned to the world outside, to the port on her screen, to the legacy on her shoulders. The final caption did not appear in the air, but in the set of her spine, in the calm focus of her gaze as she sat at her desk and opened the first report on the Scandinavian Energy Fund. Strength wasn't about the explosion in the courtroom. It was in the quiet click of the vault door closing on the past, and the steady, purposeful hand now turning the key to the future. She had reclaimed her name, her power, and her narrative. Now she had to build something real with it, this time for herself. The story of Alara Thorne was over. The story of Alara Van Holt had simply resumed.